about the 5,000, or 5,000 and more, or 5,000 maybe. Because 5,000 is kind of an absurd number, thinking about how small the towns were back then. But anyways, we'll get into that a little bit later. But I have this handout for all of you. I sent it to our Zoomers, and you have it in front of you. I tried to make it as colorful as possible. And each highlight, underline, color, font change, you can see notes the similarities between each of the stories that are told. We have Matthew 14, 13 through 21, Mark 6, 30 through 44, Luke 9, verses 10 through 17, and John 6, verses 1 through 15. I think for John and Mark, there are some fonts that are a little bit different, or highlights that are a little bit different, because there are some places that the story differs in those gospels. So the story is in all of the gospels, as you see, but it actually happens 6 times overall, like this kind of gist of the story. There's the feeding of the 4,000 in Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 through 39, and in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. So there are 6 instances that this story occurs. So it's obviously very important if it occurs that many times and across all the gospels, right? And it's a great story. So I really enjoyed getting to go over it again and compare it. And I hope this handout was so much fun creating, because I got to see the similarities and the differences. And so we can go ahead and start looking. We'll start with Mark. As you most know, Mark is the earliest gospel that we have. And so Matthew and Luke are abbreviated versions of the Mark story. As you can see on the second page, they're actually shorter, right? They look shorter than the story. But they have, they copy Mark the most. And John does copy Mark a lot. But John also kind of does embellish a few things and add a few touches, where I feel like we get those images of the story, right? John is the only one that notes they were on a mountain, right? This like mountainside kind of scene that you usually picture with the feeding of the 5,000 is in John. And the boy who has the loaves and the fish is only mentioned in John. And the note of what type of loaves they are specifically, barley loaves, is also in John. And them actually talking about Jesus's identity as a prophet only happens in John. So a little bit of a setting. Oh, I'm in Matthew. Hold on. Okay. Setting for Mark is before this, in the beginning of chapter 6, the disciples were sent out to teach, preach, and heal. And this is the only mention of somebody other than Jesus teaching in the Gospel of Mark. And then between the sending out of the 12 disciples and the feeding of the 5,000, it is the story of John the Baptist beheading by Herod. And so when we come back to this section here, the disciples return really excited to tell Jesus about, their healings and their teachings and what's been going on. And so I think, let me see if I have one. Okay, yeah. So John the Baptist is beheaded, which means that a prophet who is now gone. And so now it's all about Jesus and his identity and what he's doing, right? So after the disciples come back, they want to go ahead and get some rest. Jesus wants to help them get some rest, and they try to get away. And we see that the disciples and Jesus haven't had a chance to eat, so they try to go away, and the crowds keep following them. And Jesus has compassion for them. And that's a main theme within the story about Jesus having compassion and caring for the people, right? So he saw a great crowd and he had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things, right? So he continued the work that he had sent out the disciples to do. and had compassion for them, for them following him, right? They wanted to see Jesus. They did everything they could. They were kind of stalkerish following the disciples, right? They watched him going ashore. And I like this, the word compassion is to be moved in the inward parts, which is really interesting because I feel like Jesus is hungry in this moment, right? So when you're hungry, I feel like it's kind of hard to be compassionate, right? We have the term hangry for a reason. You're not so compassionate, you're not so kind usually when you're hungry, but Jesus in this instant, even though he's hungry, even though probably would like to hang out with the disciples and get them fed and figure out what they've been doing, Jesus is moved so much that instead of going to be fed, instead of going to be nourished, goes ahead and goes to the people, right? And there are three elements in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It notes that it's late. It notes that they are in a deserted place, a desolate place. It notes that in all of the Gospels. They go, yeah, and the desert is a place that is noted often in the Bible, right? It's where the Israelites are, where God provides. So it's often a place of God's provision is seen and God's presence, especially in a place where there isn't much, right? A desert is usually there's not much, there aren't many people around, there aren't many resources, and yet God provides. And so the story of Mark goes throughout, it notes Old Testament elements throughout the whole story, right? So as I mentioned, the wilderness setting for the people of God en route to a promised land recalls the Israelites in the wilderness. It talks about Jesus having compassion for them. They were like sheep without a shepherd, which notes when Moses was called to lead the people of God. And then as we continue on to the story, it talks about he asked the disciples to give them something to eat, right? They asked Jesus, the disciples say, send them away so that they can find food. The desert isn't a place to, there's nothing here for them. We don't have anything for them. When they were sent out without food, without money, without anything. They were sent out just as they were to go ahead and preach and teach. So they suggest to go let them figure out their meal, and Jesus answers, you give them something to eat. And they respond, are we to go buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them to eat? 200 denarii was worth about 2/3 of a laborer's yearly wage. So you're talking about a lot of money. So obviously the scale is huge, right? There are lots of people there that need to be fed. That's ironic because they don't have anything to feed them with. They don't have money. They were sent out without anything. They were sent out. And so they're saying, we'll do whatever we can for you, Jesus, but we don't really have the. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they said 5 and 2. And then he orders them to sit down in various groups, which is again recalling back to kind of the Israelite campsites. To go and sit down, or like a symposium is the word that is used there, to gather in groups, which was like a formal banquet. Which uses a formal banquet. So they went and they sat down, and they took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven and blessed it and broke the loaves and gave it to them, to his disciples, to set before the people. And then the miracle happens, right? They bring 5 loaves and 2 fish. Imagine, have you ever been to like a concert? Have you been to like a venue or where else? It's on the place I'm thinking of, like where there's thousands of people gathered. I'd imagine like 1,000 people, thousands of people gathered, and then you bring 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's incredibly absurd, the picture, right? Like thousands of people bring 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Just happened.
Yeah, they just happen to have that, and that's what they bring. And I don't know about you, but I could eat a lot of bread, and I could eat a lot of fish, and I couldn't eat 5 loaves and 2 bread, 2 fish worth, but I could eat, a good amount. Probably us in this room, there's about 5 of us here, probably could go through that, pretty quickly. And what happens? It feeds all of them, right? It feeds all of them, and then there's some still left over. And so it recalls another miracle story in the Old Testament by Elisha, after the death of Elijah. So you kind of see this parallel. Great prophet Elijah passes, and now Elisha takes the lead and provides for God's people in the same thing, like a camp, all gathered together. And it's this messianic banquet, right? It's a representation of those who were without now will have some and more provided by God through Jesus, right? Yeah, verse 39, if you look on the second page, talks about asking the people to sit down on the green grass, alludes to Psalms 23, right? Makes me lay down in green pastures. Again, that kind of shepherd imagery that was noted earlier continues in this section through Psalm 23. People didn't bring anything to see Jesus, right? They didn't really prepare to be there all day. They didn't prepare for what was to come, that it'd be super late. And still they're there throughout the whole day, waiting to hear what Jesus has to say. It continues in Mark's kind of messianic secret. They saw the miracle, but still don't really know what's going on. They don't have any proclamation of who Jesus is. That only happens in John. Right? They're not saying Jesus is his prophet, even though they know the story of Elisha, even though they know the story of the manna in the wilderness. They don't really even the disciples, right? They don't really see that and say, oh my gosh, you must be a prophet. Oh my gosh, you must be God, right? There's no proclamation that happens, even though this miracle happens. And the story isn't necessarily seen as historical, right? That this actually happened in real life, that there were this great crowd of thousands of people meeting Jesus on a hill and listening to his teaching. But it is important historically within the context of who Jesus is and the greater eschatological, right? This banquet feast isn't just for those people when Jesus came, right? This abundance, this goodness, this love, all of that abundance isn't just for when Jesus was there, but is now forevermore for the rest of the people of God, for the whole people of God. Before, again, it was only for Israel and for specific group of people, but now it's for all people, right? And it's a lot of people. It's not just a specific group. So yeah, it's kind of, I went through the mark. I feel like I went through that kind of fast. There's a lot of just a lot of details in this story that I don't know if I before had ever thought of either, of how there isn't a care of, even it notes, there isn't a care of preparing the food, right? We know that in Jewish ritual and law, you're supposed to have this preparation that you have for the food, right? Washing of the hands, the cleansing, is this food been prepared correctly? Is it, been tithed on? All these questions. And none of that is questioned here by Jesus or the disciples, right? It happened, the miracle happens. But the most important thing isn't the food and how it's prepared, it's the miracle of the giving of the food in abundance by Jesus, by God. In Matthew and Luke, I believe there is before this, it notes, I think, and Mark as well, sorry. Before this, it notes, right, the beheading of John the Baptist and a feast that Herod is giving. I think Matthew and Mark. And so it's supposed to be a contrast, right? So Herod has this great feast, has this, birthday party. It's amazing. It's abundant. And it ends with a very violent, terrible thing, right? And the contrast, the foil to that is Jesus, who doesn't respond with violence at this horrible situation, this horrible power struggle that occurs, right? The murder of a relative, of somebody who prepared the way for him. Instead, Jesus decides to show compassion and show care for the hungry, right? Getting food back then wasn't always easy, and you didn't always eat your fill, right? It says in the story at the end of each one that they ate their fill. They were so full, the way in that you would fill like a calf or for fattening to like prepare for an extravagant and big meal, right? So they ate their fill, and then there was still some left over even afterwards. So I want to go through, I have a couple notes here of the references that go back to this story. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn to them. But before I go ahead and do that, do you have any comments? If you've had a chance to kind of look over the handouts or anything that I'll give you like a minute to look at it. Is there anything you note in particular that you didn't? Yeah, Bob?
I got a question, 2 things. We know how far away they were from a city. Is there any reference to that? Were they way out in the wilderness, or were they like going to Mount Helix?
They were close enough to a city where, the disciples say that let them go to the town. So like it was close enough that they could walk, but it wasn't close enough where, like it made sense for them to also just go and walk and do that versus.
It depends on which account you read.
That as well, yeah.
Because one of them says they went away to Mark. They went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves, and then people followed them there.
Right.
Yeah.
But then in John, he goes up on a mountain, and I think that, yeah. Yeah, he goes, I mean, maybe that's like the Mount Helix one where he goes up on the mountain.
Yeah, yeah.
You could also read the disciples let them go get food as saying, well, they followed us here. That was their choice. They followed us without being prepared. Let them deal with it themselves. Kind of a petty, passive aggressive response. Like, we didn't want them here in the first place, so let them go feed themselves.
And the first 3, right, like the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right, they were also coming back and they don't have anything. So they were like, we've already been fending for ourselves, so they can go ahead and also fend for themselves. But it was still, like it may have been a journey to get there, but if they still could have walked and to go get their own food.
With this story for me, I almost think it was a reference to the story of the stone soup, where there are things that these people do bring, because they do not, back in those times, even whatever distance they were going, they always had some food with them at the time.
Yeah.
So for me, that is more of a miracle for me than, God goes, oof, and poof, and it's there, is that they all contributed together where they usually wouldn't. You're from a different city than I'm from, or a town, and I don't know you, but I will share with you, which I think is more of a miracle for me. That hits more home to me than God going, poof, it's there. So that's where I deal with this story more than anything else, is that it's more like stone. Everybody knows what the story is, where all we have is water and a stone, and then everybody starts putting things together. So that's where the story leads with me.
Yeah, and that's what kind of is happening in the story of Luke as well.
Yeah.
Right. So, and Luke, I'm so sorry, I mixed up my notes. I'm not exactly trying to see is it in Luke? Yes. So I believe in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples feed the 5,000. Right. So it's saying that the people are the hands and feet of Jesus. The disciples, the apostles, are the hands and feet of Jesus. But ultimately, Jesus or God is the one that provides. Right. Which then in Acts, we will see that is brought up over and over again at the beginning of the church, right? Literally feeding the hungry, having these meals together, gathering together with people you wouldn't have usually gathered together with to go ahead and share a meal. And that's a great point you make, Bob. Again, we don't know who was in the crowd completely, but also we know that that if there was only Jewish people, that they had to have this food prepared, or maybe they didn't care, right? They saw their neighbor, they saw what Jesus was doing as a leader, and then making their decision on this doesn't really matter, we're too hungry to care. Or we've been given this example in Jesus, right? If Jesus is eating with these people, so will I, right? So that's what also this story is about. We see often the reference of food in the gospel stories, right? With Jesus eating with people he's not supposed to be eating with, interacting, right? And mealtime, again, like I said, is so important because there's so much that needs to go into being prepared. That even happens in Acts, right? In the conversation with Paul, right? How do you, eat with people who don't follow the same rules as I do? You make them comfortable. You accommodate. You do it in love, not in just because it doesn't matter anymore. But if it's more important to care about your neighbor through this act, then you go ahead and do it, right? And again, so this is showing that those ritualists, those little things that get in the way, don't matter as much as the bigger picture here. And that is all of God's people are coming together to be fed by God. I think one thing that was also noted in one of the commentaries that I read is that maybe some of these people here weren't necessarily here to cared about Jesus's teaching, right? They just saw a crowd and they joined the crowd, right? They just saw everybody
There's a line. I'm gonna
walking.
get
So
in
yeah,
there.
we're all walking over there wherever they're going, right? And some of them probably left being filled and fed and didn't even, believe in Jesus. They just continued on their merry way afterward. And yet they were still fed. And yet they were still cared for. And yet God's abundance was still offered and provided to them. Right? That's really hard for me and for the church, I think, to hear, right? Is that you give expecting nothing in return. And Jesus and God does do this often, right? Give without expecting anything in return. I would like to believe that Jesus knew who was out there in the crowd. Didn't know, but you can see who's out there. He's walked around probably and knew who was out there and still said they needed to be fed. So that's a great point, Bob. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Is there anything else that you notice in particular looking at this handout or that you like about the story?
Tessa, can you hear me? One of the contrasts between this for me and the Old Testament, we think about the people in the wilderness being miraculously fed every day from heaven by God when they had no supplies left. Is that in this, the leftovers were gathered, that was okay to do. In our story of the feeding of the 4,000 or 5,000 or however many, but in Moses, with the stories of Moses and the people in the wilderness, they were not supposed to hold on to the food after the meal. It would not be good the next day. They were not allowed to try to store some aside after each day. And then they gathered it up, and that was an okay thing to do, what was left over, which was miraculous that there was anything left over. But
yes, except for one day, right? They were allowed to gather so that on the Sabbath.
Yeah, so that they would not be working on the Sabbath. Yes.
Yes. And I think, I'm so sorry again, I mixed around my notes, but I believe in John. In the chapter of John, the story beforehand is the healing on the Sabbath of the man, the blind man. Yeah. So Jesus, in the previous chapter, John chapter 5 at the end, or that's in the chapter, Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and he is fighting with the religious authorities about his ability to do right? And I think the story is great after this, right? Because it refers back to that original time when you weren't supposed to, you're not supposed to heal on Sabbath, but also you're not supposed to gather the food. But now with Jesus, it's a whole different ballgame. Now there's more food, so much more food in abundance, right? Jesus brings abundance. God has come through Jesus to bring abundance, right? Now this table is for everybody. This food is for everybody. It's long enough, it's wide enough, it's deep enough so that everybody can sit and take their fill, and then you can gather the food. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, Cheryl, that's an important thing to know. Going back to, that story of the manna. I'm gonna take a quick look at these, and then we can go into some more details of the comparisons within each of the chapters. I'm gonna sit down as well, sorry, my legs are a little tired.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go through these real quick. I have them bookmarked here. Ironically, Matthew is more about portraying Jesus as Moses, right? We heard that from Reverend Renee a few weeks ago at the beginning. And yet, Matthew doesn't, because Matthew is so abbreviated, you get glimpse and hits of that a reference to the Old Testament versus in the story within Mark, that is heavy within the whole story, right? So I'm going to turn to Numbers chapter 27, verses 16 through 17. And this is speaking to that shepherd, right? Sheep without a shepherd. So it says, verse 16, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint someone over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd. Right, and then we see that reference of Jesus, who is the good shepherd eventually, right? And I'm going to go to Exodus. We're just going to go to chapter 16, verses 4 through 5. This is the manna from heaven story. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. And that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days. And then I'm going to go to the 2 Kings reference. The 2 Kings reference is the story of Elisha feeding a troop of men. It's called Elisha feeds 100 men. So I love that it has 100 men and then it goes from 100 to 5,000, right? But I'm going to read it and I don't know, it just makes me laugh. A man from Baal Shalisha bringing food from the first fruits to the man of God, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Elisha said, give it to the people and let them eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 people? But he repeated, give it to the people and let them eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. He set it before them, they ate and had some left according to the word of the Lord. In this story, there are 20 loaves of barley, right? Barley was used particularly for people. They use barley more often to make bread. And so here you have 100 men, and they're like, 20 isn't enough to feed 100 men, right? So then you go from 100 times 50, right? 5,000, and there are, 4 times less bread, right? And still the people are fed, and again, some is left over, right? Again, it's just, I imagine the scene, right? Just so silly them bringing this. And Luke, it's the disciples who have the bread and the loaves, right? And they're like, this is all we have, right? And they have no idea what's about to happen. They just kind of like, this is all we can do. And I think there's one more in Deuteronomy 8, verses 7 through 10. And this is the prophecy of God bringing them to the promised land and providing for them, right? So for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olives and olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, and a land whose stones are iron and from whose hills you mine copper. You shall eat your fill. Right? It's the contrast with that and with this story is interesting as well, as we mentioned, right? This is talking about a place that is filled with abundance, a place that has everything and more, right? A place where, of course, it makes sense that you will eat your fill because there are so many options to gather from. In this story, they're in the desert. There are no local vendors to go buy from real quick. Again, it's a place where God provides, right? Any other comments on the story or anything you see?
Just a question. I seem to recall, but I may be mixing it up in some Bible study of maybe some years ago, that that numbers used in this time, especially numbers denoting a great many, are never meant as precise statistics as we use them today. That when you see the number 40, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean 40. It just means that there were a great many of something, more than people could count or countenance in some kind of way. And I'm wondering if it's the same with these hundreds and thousands and things like that.
Yeah. As I mentioned in the beginning, towns weren't that big back then, so it's kind of hard to know if there were really 5,000 there. But it's interesting the way that they use even the word men or people in each of these stories. So Mark uses the word for men as a general, right? There were 5,000 people there. Given a rough estimate, and again, it's not supposed to be an exact number, but it's meant to say that there were a lot so that you understand the gravity of this miracle. Matthew says men in particular, right? Say there was 5,000 men and besides women and children. So they both use that kind of guesstimate big number in different ways. Matthew specifically says there's 5,000 men and women and children. So you're right there. It was supposed to just show the grandness of this miracle of Jesus and God's care for God's people. It's just huge. It's just super abundant. There's also just a numbers thing. There isn't really a significance between the loaves and the fish, right? 5 isn't. People try to use 5 as the number, the Pentateuch. The Torah, 2 is the 2 new covenants. It's not really what's going on here. It's just part of the story. Yeah. Else I should know. Yeah. I noted, that Jesus specifically in John is the one who gives the food to the people, passes out the food to the people, versus in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the disciples who do that, who thanks to Jesus, thanks to God, do the work. But again, it shows that the gift of food comes from Jesus and in turn God, because Jesus is God. To see if there's one. In Luke, this story is sandwiched in between the sending and Herod asking, who Jesus is, and the story after Luke is proclamation. Who says that Jesus is Peter, right? It's in Luke, it begins with asking who Jesus is, and then who Jesus is with the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and then it ends with who Jesus is, right? Yeah, that's all the notes I have for this story. And then in John, at the end, this is the only time, as I mentioned, that people note when they, verse 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Going back to that wilderness, in Jewish history, it was believed that the Messiah would come to God's people in the wilderness. So there would be often excursions into the wilderness, praying for the Messiah to arrive and save them from the Roman Empire. And again, it's and when Jesus realizes this, he withdraws himself, right? Because the kingdom, the king, the Messiah that these people are expecting is different than who Jesus is. We see that in the other gospels, again, that contrast of extravagance, of leadership that exploits what they have, that is violent, that uses their powers to bring down. And instead you have this, again, that foil, that contrast of Jesus having compassion for the people, being with the outsiders, the lowly, and not only providing for them, but providing in abundance. And that's not only, again, for that story, but will continue. The messianic banquet, the future banquet, means that God will provide, not now and not yet, and forevermore, right? Will be a part of, and that's interesting to me, that you have this, I feel like this notion of minimalism or piety, where you strip everything down and you only have what you need. And yet this messianic banquet, this food is provided to your fill and then in abundance, right? And it's provided for all kinds of people in ways that are unconventional, and is also done by the early church, right? And so I think that's really telling for us today in the way that we care for those who are hungry, for those who are in need, right? It goes back to that, if they need your coat, if they need a coat, give them your coat. If they need you to go a mile, go another mile. I think God gives and gives abundantly, goes above and beyond. So any other questions, any other comments? Cheryl?
Well, to add to that, that's why I have always been so pleased is not the right word, but let's say pleased with how we do Welcome Saturday, which is that we keep the food coming. It's not like, okay, you get 1 plate or 2 plate and you're done, or you get 3 strips of bacon and that's all we're giving per person. That's not God's plan or promise here. And so I am so glad and grateful that Welcome Saturday is that we keep the food coming as long as we can find food from anywhere, and people go out and buy more if there's still, we want more bacon or eggs or whatever. So that's just something that came to mind as you were talking in that way. Also, it's so strange that we've developed this idea that asceticism is pleasing to God when we have all of these messages about God's wish for abundance.
And that was, incredibly fascinating to me in particular. And I mean, you see it throughout scripture, just this overflowing of gifts and from God. And then we try to limit what people can have. I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, but in this time it was believed that if you had abundance, that you essentially got it by incorrect means, right? So if you were wealthy, you got it because you exploited other people.
That's why they all didn't like tax collectors.
And right, and I mean, the wealthy, right? In particular.
Well, that was more allegiance with Rome.
Right.
The tax collectors.
Yeah. But the wealthy people were probably Romans, like
Yes.
Yeah.
colluding with
Yeah.
Rome, so just not
not
wanting to be on that side.
Again, there were just I feel like there's so many boundaries and layers. And again, if you had enough, it's because you hoarded it, or you took it, or you exploited people, which isn't, too far-fetched from today, right? But again, we see that in Acts that people give away plots of land. They don't give everything away. I don't think that's something that people don't notice, is that these landowners don't give everything away. They give a plot or two away so that the people who are hungry or without can have at least some or enough, right? And so it's to provide for the good of the community. And again, going back to that, they don't know, they may not have been rubbing shoulders with them before, but now is that you're proclaiming to be a part of this community, the community of God, the community of Jesus Christ. And now that kind of goes out the window, right? It's just trying to model and example the gifts that God is bringing to people. And yeah, I just love the story because it shows that in abundance that we're supposed to have abundance and to provide that for one another. I think is different than we hear nowadays.
And it's an abundance that continues. I'm struck by the fact that in each story, there are 12 baskets left, more, it seems, than what they started with. And I'd like to spin out a story about what happens to what's in those 12 baskets, that they get distributed to people in need or people who are hungry. And it always surprises me that in none of these stories, well, I guess they are surprised, but there's not a great hoorah about what a miracle this is, because it is a great miracle and it feels a little hidden, the miracle part.
And that comes from, because it originated from Mark, kind of that secret, that messianic secret where they see it, right? But they don't get what's going on. The disciples see it firsthand. They're the ones passing this food out. They know exactly how many loaves, how many fish, and they still don't get it. And because of, the Matthew and the Luke come from that, from Mark, it kind of has those elements within that as well.
Okay.
That's such a good point. The crowd doesn't necessarily know that they didn't always, that the people passing out the food didn't always have all of this food that they're passing out.
Yeah.
I mean, in John they do. In John they do see it, and they do, respond, I think, appropriately in some way to the magnitude of this. But you're right, and the others they don't. And that is also great. God works in mystery and through others, even when you don't see it. So when are those moments that you can provide that for other people? I think is in this as well. When can you be that secret gift, provide that to others, not just what they need, but more than. Yes, thank you. John?
Yeah, I have a question. Obviously, I was tardy today, but why did we have the Old? Why did we have the Old Testament? Did they foresee a peace?
It refers to the way that in the Old Testament that God provided for God's people or shepherd, all of those imagery that we see in this story is seen in the Old Testament, kind of fulfilled and honestly superseded by Jesus in this story. Any other questions, comments? I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much. I hope this is handy for you. I really like it.
That was great, Tessa. Thank you for doing all of that work and copying all of the scripture into a handout too. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. All right, everybody, we'll see you in service